All right, guys. Video 2 out of 2. We were talking about mercantilism last time. Just to reiterate, these laws where items had to be shipped to England first, and then taxes were added, and then they could be shipped out to other markets. They were called enumerated articles. And so, again, this is just another way that the British were able to have monopolies over these English goods. Next is writs of assistance. And they're not really assisting anyone. Basically, what they're doing is they're giving the British Navy the right to search ships for any reason. These started in 1761. They were general warrants, and they allowed officials to search for smuggled materials. And these are all passed in response to smuggling. They had to search within suspected premises. They could go on ships. They could search the hulls. And one man who challenged this in the English courts was a man named James Otis. He was attorney general here in the colonies, and he is the one who came up with the slogan, the phrase rather, of no taxation without representation. So he challenged the writs in the English courts, and he said that they violated the rights of all Englishmen. And he actually resigned his position of attorney general because of this. Again, James Otis. So after the 7 Years' War, again, the navigation laws are going to go back into effect. They're going to help pay for the debt of the war. And also, Americans are going to be asked to pay for British soldiers that are still in the Americas. New prime minister in England is going to help enforce these new laws. His name was George Grenville in 1763. And a new law is going to be passed called the Sugar Act in 1764. And the Sugar Act is going to raise duties and taxes on foreign sugar from the West Indies. And of course, this is going to increase resentment from the English colonists who depend on sugar, and so on and so forth. One of the other more egregious acts is the Quartering Act, something you probably heard about before, where colonists had to provide food and lodging for British soldiers. New York actually refused to comply with the Quartering Act, saying that it violated their rights. And this is something that will come about later as far as New York not following Mama's Law, as it were. A few other things to add here. Again, these are all going to increase resistance to the British. One of them called the Stamp Tax, 1765. You've heard of this before. It was used to raise revenue in North America, paying for the military. The interesting thing here is it was already used in England at the time on more products than what the New World had on stamps. Things like marriage certificates, pamphlets, diplomas, newspapers, playing cards. All those things were taxed in England, but they weren't taxed in the New World. But even though it was less harsh, it was still a point of contention for North American colonists. Okay. Next is the Admiralty courts. Basically, these were courts where there was no jury. No taxation without representation. Again, this is something we just talked about. Came about because of James Otis, the Attorney General, and what the colonists wanted was they wanted actual representation. They didn't want sort of virtual representation. The Admiralty courts, no juries for people who violated the Sugar Stamp Act, and defendants had to prove their innocence, and that violated the old principle in England of innocent until proven guilty. As far as virtual versus actual, the argument here was that the colonists didn't have actual representation. The British said, no, you do have representation. Parliament represents everyone in all the colonies and all the territories of Great Britain. It didn't really fly. So when we talk about the stamp tax and we talk about other types of taxes on North American goods, a way to think about it is tariffs today. 2019, we have political leaders who are putting tariffs on foreign products to protect the domestic products. And this is sort of the same thing that was going on with the Stamp Tax and the Sugar Act and all those different things. So it's important to understand that this is not something new, and it's been around for a while. Okay, so the Stamp Act Congress. In 1765, 9 colonies met in New York City, and they asked the king to repeal the Stamp Act. This united the colonists. The Stamp Act hurt all these economies economically, And so one of the ways that they would hurt the British was through non-importation agreements. Basically, these are boycotts, and these were enforced by the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty. Um, this actually hurt England, or was supposed to hurt England, because 1/4 of all British exports were from the New World. A half of the British shipping was devoted to American trade. So, excuse me, when I said 1/4, what I meant was Great Britain exported 1/4 of its goods to the New World. So by not buying British goods, this boycott is supposed to get the Stamp Act repealed. So it not only affected the New World, it also affected people in England because they lost business. So it led for demands to repeal it in England there as well. It didn't really work that well because most people only considered it a small tax. Eventually, though, it was repealed. When we talk about the Stamp Act being repealed, it finally was repealed, and a lot of colonists rejoiced. They actually cast a bronze statue of King George II because they were so happy that the Stamp Act was gone. But in its place came another act called the Declaratory Act. And basically, this increased Parliament's taxing authority. It said that if Parliament can tax any colony or anyone in England, um, they can tax them all the same. So it increased the taxation in the New World and made it equal to that of England. Okay, Champagne Charlie Townshend, he was the prime minister at the time, and he came up with 4 acts called the Townshend Acts, a part of the Declaratory Acts that made things even worse. So they got the Stamp Act repealed, but indirectly, things got worse. So the first one was called the Suspending Act, and what it did was it suspended New York and their assembly until they complied with the Quartering Act. We talked about them earlier. The second was the Revenue Act, and it directly raised money for England on things like tea, glass, paper, paint, lead. And there were stricter and more arbitrary additions to the customs process. There were more people, more manpower, and more sort of hoops to jump through. And the American colonists had to pay for it. This is another part of the Townshend Acts. And finally, the Indemnity Act was to battle tea smuggling by the Dutch. It basically gave the East India Company lesser duties and actually gave them rebates for the business that they did. We'll talk more about the East India Company here in just a minute. But the East India Company, it's important to note that they provided at one point half of the world's trade, and they were an English joint stock company. So if they're doing poorly, a lot of people in England are doing poorly as well. So here's a picture of old Charlie Townshend, unliked by the colonists. And next we'll talk about the Boston Massacre. I think we'll stop for now and go on to video 3.